Just briefly on relational cues and hostile attribution bias. Again, this goes down to neuroception and our ability to interpret social cues. If we've secure attachment, if we've grown up in a safe, happy, emotionally nurturing home, then we'll go into the world and trust that people are fundamentally decent and kind. We'll be friendly to other children, or we're more likely to be friendly and curious. And we're also going to be more likely to like our teachers and be liked by our teachers. However, if we grow up in an unsafe home with disorganized attachment, shouting and screaming and emotional abuse and neglect, then we're going to have a very hard time reading relational cues properly. In fact, we're going to go out into the world expecting people to be horrible, to be abusive like the adults who supposedly love us. And so the phenomenon of hostile attribution bias is actually, from an evolutionary point of view, and again, as mammals, it makes sense that if our experience is that human beings are violent, abusive, and want to shame us and blame us, then that's what we'll expect. So regardless of the cue that is being given to us, even if it's a neutral cue, even if the teacher isn't angry, she just has a kind of blankish face, we will read that as a threat. And that might send our bodies into survival mode. Our brains, again, the downstairs brain will take over, we'll be emotionally reactive, and our neocortex will be completely surplus to requirements. So there's a nice quote here from Bruce Perry and colleagues, that speaks to hostile attribution bias. It says, the person with attachment problems and relationally mediated abuse will find relational cues such as eye contact, tone of voice, touch, and physical proximity threatening. A person with a high degree of relational sensitivity will often misinterpret neutral or positive social interactions with peers as threatening and respond by either avoiding or disengaging, which leads to problems with social learning and peer interactions, or worse, by using aggressive, hostile, or hurtful words or behaviors to push peers, teachers, and parents away. In extreme cases, as the child grows up, this relational sensitivity can result in significant antisocial or even assaultive behaviors. It is no surprise, therefore, that individuals in prison, 90% of whom have histories of interpersonal trauma in childhood, have a much larger sense of personal space than the average person, and will often respond to personal space violations with aggressive and violent behaviors. Dr. Karen Traceman states that becoming trauma-informed and responsive requires practitioners to both model the model, which is practice the behaviors that they preach, including empathy, for example, or patience and timekeeping and respect. So don't tell moms who have extremely chaotic personal circumstances that you expect them to make more of an effort to turn up on time if you can't be on time for the parent-teacher meeting, for example, because that shows disrespect and it's also not modeling the behavior that you want to see. And also professionals, including teachers, should reflect on how they story people in official reports and in conversations with colleagues or external services. So talking about children as being bold children or little pups or a piece of work or whatever, that's actually quite harmful. In a way, we all do it. We all talk about one another to other people. But if you're a professional using negative, pejorative language about a child or indeed about their caregivers, and then especially if you write it down, that has knock-on impacts for how they're kind of storied later on. And they can have, particularly very troubled children who, for example, end up in the care system, can have reams upon reams of paper written about them, most of it negative, where they are being blamed and shamed for behaviors and adaptations that are generally due to trauma and adversity and the intersections with poverty and then perhaps racial or ethnic discrimination and the like. Speaking of racial discrimination now for a while, this is a photo of Dr. Mamie Phipps Clark that was shot for Vogue in 1968. She was a psychologist, and she and her husband played a very important role in helping the lawyers to win Brown versus the Board of Education case, which was about segregation of schools, where Black children were only allowed to be educated in schools for Black children, and white children were educated in schools exclusively for white children. And so there's a link there, you can read it, it's very, very interesting indeed, about how the Clarks' dolls experiment played a really important role in this seminal case. They actually had to paint a doll Black because doll manufacturers weren't making Black dolls at the time of this case. And they wanted to see what Black children's attitudes were to the dolls. Perhaps unsurprisingly, but devastatingly, most of the little Black children preferred the white dolls. And this fact, the fact that they had internalized racism, and the fact that white bodies, white baby dolls were more attractive than Black ones, proved very influential to the court actually in deciding that segregation was cruel and needed to be ended. So Chief Justice Earle wrote, to separate Black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Now, the reason I put that quote in is actually because of the vagus nerve. And you might recall that the vagus nerve stretches from our gut up to our heart, through our lungs, into our face, our ears, and our brainstem. So in fact, the Chief Justice Earle is entirely correct that the trauma of racism, instilling a feeling of unsafety, frankly, in the world, as well as inferiority, would typically impact any child's sense of neural safety. So their nervous system would be in a chronic state of defense. It would impact potentially their gut, impact their heart, impact their breathing. And there are links to increased rates of asthma in African American women who are exposed to multiple racist incidences, according to Dr. Gabor Mate. But the point is, trauma is an embodied experience. It impacts our hearts and our minds and pretty much everything in between, or it can do. Race Reflections by Dr. Guiane Kinuani. I've mentioned her previously in an earlier session about her brilliant book, Living While Black, which she wrote actually after this article that I read. I discovered her on Twitter as well, like so many amazing, influential people. But I want you to think about this because Guiane grew up in France, in Paris, as a Black woman. She then moved to the UK and is a psychologist there. She's an amazingly smart, eloquent woman. And she has witnessed horrendous ill treatment based on race towards her mother as a girl in France. And then she experienced hostile and diminishing treatment in schools herself in France as a Black girl. And her children have also experienced denigrating treatment by teachers in schools now in the UK. So institutionalized racism is a serious, serious problem. And she says this shit is exhausting, this shit is distressing. Attitudes, processes, behavior, prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, stereotyping. Schools are structurally and institutionally racist, and they are continuing by and large to get away with it without the kind of scrutiny that the police attracts. But how challenging to parent your children and hear stories of them coming home from school where they have been somehow made to feel small or lesser or not as bright or capable as other students simply because of their skin color. And she was from a big family. Most of her siblings have gone on to do great things. They've accomplished an awful lot, but they were all expected to do not very much by their teachers when they were at school because of their skin color, she alleges. So read that blog if you're interested. And as I say, I highly recommend her book, Living While Black. It's very fascinating and gutting on the impact of white supremacy and racialized trauma. And I've said before, we all have a role to play in this, and I really believe it, that we do have a role to play. Just going back to the dolls thing, I was very pleased and proud when my daughter Aurora, as a small baby, the first doll that she chose at Smith's toy store was a little black baby doll, which we called Baby Lola. And, you know, imagine if I'd responded differently. You know, in my youth, who knows how I'd have responded, because I've grown in how I think and feel by learning about many things, including trauma, and just how we all have the basic same needs to feel safe and have a sense of love and belonging in the world. But imagine if when she was a tiny little toddler, if I'd said, no, you're not getting that doll, you need to get a white doll, you're white, so you know you should have a white doll, which I'm sure is what my own mother would have done, probably also in the here and now, because she is frankly not as enlightened as I have become in this matter. That would have sent a powerful message to my daughter as a toddler, that there's a difference between white and black somehow, that black is not as good as white, and that she should only be interested in white. I would have been baking in white supremacy and the values of that and the tyranny of that at a very early age. But instead, I just let Aurora have the doll that she wanted. She was happy with playing with Baby Lola. But that is probably quite uncommon, and it might seem like a very small thing, but we teach our children from the time that they are born what to expect, what's acceptable in the world, and they will adapt their behaviors to try and maintain an attachment to us no matter what. So if we're racist, they will, as an attachment behavior, also express angry racist attitudes too. Or if, you know, we're intolerant to gay people, they will also express those type of views because that's what we express and they want to be like us. Which leads nicely on to traumatic reenactment and repetition compulsion. We repeat what we don't repair, and we repeat what we don't even remember. It's important to realize this. So in the context of school, if children have grown up in a household, or they're living in a household where they've developed unhealthy, insecure, and disorganized relating patterns as babies, then they're highly likely to unconsciously reenact those same type of dynamics in their relationships going forward, including with teachers and school peers. So they will push people away if that's how they've learned to deal with things, or they will just walk away from the slightest bit of conflict if that's their coping strategy, or they might just, again, disconnect and shut down. But they might also prompt teachers to respond to them in angry ways because they expect an angry response, because that's what they've always gotten from their caregivers. That's what they will elicit. And they won't be aware of this. So their behaviors, if they feel unsafe, might be fight behaviors. They might get angry, or they might be just restless and won't sit down, or they won't do as they're told. And so they draw on the negative energies of their teachers. And so the cycle continues. And so the messaging that they're getting is continually harsh. They're a bold child, a bad child. They don't know how to behave. They have challenging behaviors, and then they internalize this. on top of all of what they've already internalized, that they're worthless and that their needs are unimportant and that no one would like them, that they're useless. All of this is added to the mix. All the negative interactions with their teachers and their peers are added to the mix. And they do believe that they are the problem, that they are fundamentally unlovable and dislikable. Repetition compulsion is a psychological phenomenon where people unwittingly repeat the past. And it doesn't stop in childhood. In adulthood, people also unwittingly repeat the past. Dan Siegel describes memory as the way past events affect future functioning. And there's a childhood emotional neglect expert called Jonice Webb, who says that people with CEN are likely to have very kind of negative relationships with other people. It has an invisible effect on them and weighs them down without their knowledge. Linda Esposito, a psychotherapist from California, defines repetition compulsion as where a person repeats traumatic event or circumstance over and over again, which includes reenacting the event itself or putting oneself in situations where the event is likely to happen again. And this can kind of explain why some people who were sexually abused in childhood might also be subject to sexual violence later on in life, sometimes multiple times. They're often re-victimized in adulthood. So schools, though, have a huge role to play in building resilience. Robbie Gilligan says that we need to harness this resilience enhancing potential of school and spare time activities like playing sports. In his view, it's really important to try and reduce the stockpile of problems for children with high levels of vulnerability and adversity, including those who are in the care system. Gilligan says that a child's resilience, in other words, their ability to cope with adversity and enjoy normal development, which is a phrase from Fonagy and colleagues, depends on the dosage of their adversity. So 1 or 2 negative situations will be generally survivable, but additional difficulties take a real negative toll on children. The higher the dose of adversity, the greater the strain on the child. Again, this harps back to the ACEs study and also the findings from Samarov that it's the accumulation of adversity that really does the damage. So according to Gilligan, the goal must be to reduce the amount of adversity and increase the volume of positive, joyful, connected experiences. This is very similar to the discussion that we had about resilience and using the kind of teeter-totter, or what's the Irish word for it? I can't even think. Teeter-totter. You know what I mean? The shift the balance anyway, shift the equilibrium, so that the joyful, positive experiences are greater than the negative experiences. We don't want the child to be so weighed down that the seesaw, that's the word, teeter-totter equals seesaw, that there's no positive experiences that the child has in their lives, but a huge volume of negative, toxic ones. This is a very busy slide that is from the Brown and Longy study, and it's about Lincoln High. And so what they're trying to chart here is the difference between trauma victims who had little or no resilience, survivors who had moderate resilience, and thrivers who had high resilience. And so there are very big differences in relation to things like anger and depression, ability to cope and ability to plan. So the trauma victims, for example, might punch walls or bottle it up and freak out days later, or smoke weed or cut themselves. They maybe in terms of coping, don't like talking to other people about their problems. And in terms of their plans, plan to die by the age of 20 or be homeless. I mean, extremely bleak altogether. The survivors then, sometimes might get down or low, but have good people in their life to cope. They might talk it out with the teacher. And the change that they experience might be that nobody is judging you and everyone accepts you for who you are. I think about hurting myself, which I don't, since I'm strong enough not to. So that's quite a big change for a survivor. In relation to the thrivers with high resilience, in the past, someone might not have eaten for days at a time or was too sad to do anything and felt worthless. But now a big change might have been in the attitude, that it has changed since they came to Lincoln, and they look forward to every day, that they've become nicer, that they've become close enough to a teacher and can talk about anything, that they've now positive relations with other students and staff. They have proud moments, and they want to work harder and raise their grade point average. And their future plans might be to graduate from Lincoln High and maybe go to university, eventually get married and have children who will look to them as a proud role model. So there are big differences there. I think now, after this slide, we're going to watch the Lincoln High clip from Paper Tigers, because I think it's just gives a nice insight into what trauma-informed and responsive schooling can look like for teenagers. But the Longy and Brown study also says that they looked at a number of case studies aside from Lincoln High in Walla Walla, Washington. They also looked at Fern Creek, which was an elementary school in Orlando, Florida, and say that the schools show the kids show improvements in resilience and learning, but basically change requires a new theory of change, focusing not on children's behavior problems and single programs targeted at small groups of children with specific problems, but on awareness and skill capacity of adults to recognize the safety and regulating issues of trauma. So teachers, school staff, caregivers, neighbors, and service providers, and on community capacity to increase resilience to trump ACEs. So it's not just about evidence-based programs for the small few. It's massively reliant on raising awareness and improving capacity, not just for teachers, but the whole school ecology, and also for parents and the wider community, because we can all be a greater force for buffering all children, not just our own. The elephant in the room, I think, is that we need to join the dots and adopt a whole systems approach, because obviously trauma and adversity not only impact learning and behavior in classrooms, but as we discussed last week, they have huge impacts on health and healthcare costs. And as we'll be discussing at the next session, traumatized people are far more likely to end up addicted to drugs and alcohol and in the prison system. There's a link to Fintan O'Toole's piece about the No Child 2020 campaign.
Walking down every street in America, there are the kids that get labeled. Get rid of them. They're nothing but trouble. Lincoln sits right in the heart of the most assaults, gang activity, truancy.
I did hear that it was the worst school you could ever go to.
Kids had knives, fights, absolute chaos.
He pissed me off and I threw a chair at him. And I told him I was gonna kill him.
All of them were methed out.
I was invited to go to a conference about complex trauma and what stress does to the brain.
The behavior isn't the kid. The behavior is a symptom of what's going on in their life.
My mom was like, get your shit and leave. She's the only thing I had. And for her to abandon me like that.
His coping mechanism was drinking a ton, smoking a ton.
I remember one night, I didn't want to be alive.
It hit me, and it hit me really hard.
You have to unconditionally love them, and you have to believe that their behavior might be out of their control.
I love playing guitar with several of these guys. I feel like that's almost as strong as anything we ever do in class.
After that, he wasn't only a discipline figure, he was a friend.
Half of the student body had over a 3-point GPA. To watch their confidence come back has been incredible.
I'm not by myself anymore. I got a team.
If I can do it, all of you can definitely do it.
It's not that I'm judging you. I know why you're smoking weed. I know why you smoke meth. I know why you're in fights you don't want to feel. I mean, that's the big challenge is I'm asking you to try feeling for a little bit because sometimes when you feel, it guides you in the direction that you should be going and not to where you are.
So that's Paper Tigers, made by Jamie Redford, who was Robert Redford's son. Sadly, he died last year. He also made Resilience, I was going to call it a blockbuster about ACEs, but some of you might have seen it. If you haven't, and it's available to watch at some stage, either as an online screening or at some event, do try and watch it. It's pretty powerful. Again, this is a busy slide, but at Lincoln High, some of the changes identified by Longy and Brown were really about the staff again and changing values and mindsets about discipline, understanding why children misbehave and can't learn. It also required a shift in focus to providing safety and entering supportive relationships with the kids, and also supporting students to kind of try new behavioral norms that led to more safety, resilience, learning, and academic achievement. At Fern Creek, the teachers had to learn that their own internal state allows them to draw upon certain skills. In a survival state where we feel triggered by threat, these skills are fight, flight, or surrender, and we can't think clearly. So again, teaching people about interpersonal neurobiology and brain development is really useful because you can then better understand why you yourself behave in certain ways that afterwards you might be sad about or a bit ashamed about. If we go into fight mode and start shouting as parents or teachers, for example, it's not good. It is definitely harmful, but understanding why we were prompted to do that, how our own bodies felt in the moment, and reflecting about it and striving to do better the next time is really positive. They say again here, an upset emotional state is triggered by the world not going our way. It limits our ability to see from another's point of view. This upset unconscious state keeps us on autopilot, so our words and tone don't match those of key authority figures from our childhood. So our words and tone match those of authority figures from our childhood. We revert to disciplining the same ways we were disciplined, even if we know these behaviors to be ineffective or hurtful. That's so interesting because that's talking about traumatic reenactment. So if we were parented in a harsh kind of abusive way, if we were ridiculed and humiliated, we might then, as teachers, have a tendency to go into that type of disciplinary mode when we're provoked, when we feel angry or unsafe. That might be our default behavior, even though we know it was very harmful in having experienced it ourselves. Again, we repeat what we don't repair. The Head Start Trauma Smart School, one of the statements there was, I felt all alone in the classroom. I really thought these kids' issues were too big for me to handle. Now I have tools that really help. And the parents said, so that was a teacher perspective. And a parent said, I felt so incompetent as a parent. Now I have skills that work not only with my 4-year-old, but also with my 13-year-old son. I'm becoming a calm, confident parent, and my son is becoming a calm, confident teenager. So again, why couldn't our schools not only teach teachers and other staff about trauma and attachment and brain development, but also teach parents and the wider community about these things? Because if they actually want children to learn and go on to be able to be capable of being productive citizens with jobs and paying taxes and the like, and just be healthy even, then we cannot take safety for granted, and we do all have a role to play. So the case study of the Head Start Trauma Smart School in Kansas City, Missouri, reported by Longy and Brown, says, in terms of fostering relational health and community, what makes our model unique is that we help create a community where all the people who interact with children, parents, grandparents, teachers, administrators, school bus drivers, and ancillary school staff are prepared to spot the signs of trauma and help kids cope. Our multi-generational community approach is designed so that the school and home environments are aligned and children have high quality learning opportunities. We work closely with each classroom and community to tailor the program so that it meets their needs. In your own time, you might like to listen to the Cherokee legend of the two wolves as told by a prisoner from an open centre in Ireland who's delivering training on a culture of nonviolence and relapse prevention that I attended. It's a really lovely legend about the wolf of hope and despair. And basically, the wolf of despair does not need feeding. He will feed on itself, whereas the wolf of hope does need specific feeding. And he goes on to say that really we can feed the wolf of hope by engaging in positive relationships, doing things that we enjoy, and that type of thing. Relationships are an evidence-based program, according to Mary Glasgow, who's the CEO of Children's First in Scotland. She said that at the ACE Aware Nation conference in, I think it was 2018, I had the pleasure of attending. It was a remarkable experience. The energy in the room with over 3,000 people was mind-boggling, really. And relationships are an evidence-based program. They are how we change, for the better or for the worse. We build resilience through relationships. We can also arguably lose resilience through relationships. For example, if we get involved with someone who's really abusive and toxic, then our capacity to cope will decline, as will our cognitive functioning and our IQ, for example. And our capacity to parent will also be impaired in those circumstances. But brains are plastic, and they do change for the better or worse in the context of our relationships. I recommend that you watch the videos on the screen here. So the first one is an Explore Health interview with Dr. Bruce Perry, where he says the first 2 months of a child's life, whether positive or negative, are crucial to outcomes. The Oprah Winfrey interview is a clip from her 60 Minutes piece that led to her writing the book, What Happened to You, with Dr. Bruce Perry. She said that this feature on 60 Minutes about trauma, changed her life, that it was the most important piece of journalism she'd ever done. And crucially, she speaks about her teacher, Mrs. Duncan, who saw something in her, saw her talent, her spark, or her fluency as a reader, and was just kind to her and nurturing. And this for Oprah made all the difference, because unfortunately she did not come from a safe, loving home with nurture and care. She had a heap of trauma and adversity and poverty in her background. And she says we all need a Mrs. Duncan, and we do. Some children who don't have the emotional buffering relationships in their family home or wider social circumstances would really benefit from a Mrs. Duncan. The Relationship Matters interview, or rather TED Talk with Dr. Gordon Neufeld, is brilliant. He says, we were never meant to take care of children whose hearts we did not have. Learning follows attachment. And does our child like the teacher and think the teacher likes him? Neufeld says, intuitively, we know that this matters more than anything else in the learning equation. So again, relationships are vital, and love is the ultimate medicine. It is the ultimate healing balm. It's what we all need to thrive. And again, neuroplasticity, we must always bear this in mind. Brain structure and function can change over the life course for the positive or negative. Every interaction can be an intervention. This is one of Dr. Karen Traceman's catchphrases. I use it frequently in my talks and in my writings. And yeah, she also says that relational rupture requires relational repair. So behavior of management to staff, so the principal to teachers and between colleagues in any context really is hugely important. Respect and support are crucial. I recommend that you watch Nikki Murray's talk from the ACE Aware Nation conference as well. He, for me, was a revelation. I wasn't really expecting much. I for whatever reason, wasn't thinking that, you know, it was going to be terribly fascinating. And he was one of my favorites on the day because his energy and enthusiasm for the subject matter was just absolutely infectious. He says he's no longer with Burnside School now anymore, but he said, we're one of the few schools in the country that plans for regulation. Lots of hugging goes on in our school. They also follow the relate, rupture and repair cycle, and they conduct worries check-ins. So check that video out if you're interested. Also, Dr. Bruce Perry says that the sequence for effective engagement in pretty much every scenario, but particularly with traumatized children and adults, is regulate, relate, reason. And there's a link to a video where he discusses that there. But really, you don't need to be traumatized or highly stressed in general to benefit from this sequence of engagement. Regulate, relate, reason. If someone is dysregulated, they're not going to be able to really listen to any new information. They're not going to be able to relate well. They might be on edge and defensive. So by trying to regulate the nervous system, then they'll be capable of relating, and finally they'll be in a position to go into the cortex and think and plan and process new information. So folks, we're finished the session now. Our next class will be on ACEs, trauma and behavior, with a particular spotlight on addiction and criminality. Hopefully you enjoyed this session and found it useful and enlightening. I look forward to the next session.